Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the special Planning Board agenda for November 28th, 2023 at 7 p.m. The agenda is, the sole item on the agenda is the proposed amendment under the MBTA community zoning change. So we'll be here to discuss that tonight. I'll note for the record that we have a full board. And we'll start off, this is a public hearing. We will be taking public comment. We'll start off with a presentation from the staff and then go into public comment and then ask for feedback and questions from the board. And I know probably a lot of people have questions, so we'll hope to get those questions answered tonight. I know Mayor Kokoris is here and would like to open up the hearing this evening. So prior to moving into anything else, we'll have staff read the legal notice and then invite Mayor Kokoris up to give the opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Give me 1 second here. Notice is given by the Planning Board under the provisions of Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 48, Sections 3A, 5, and 11, and the Braintree Zoning Ordinance, Chapter 135, Article 15, that a public hearing will be conducted on Tuesday, November 28, 2023 at 7 p.m. in the Braintree Town Hall. The Planning Board will provide a recommendation to the Town Council on Order Number 23-0761 and 2, sponsored by the Braintree Planning Board. Said order includes a proposed zoning ordinance text amendment to Section 135-301, districts established to add a new overlay district, MBTA Communities Multifamily Overlay District, MCMOD, and a zoning ordinance text amendment to create a new section, 135-616 MBTA Communities Multifamily Overlay Districts, including zoning map amendments to create 4 MCMOD overlay subdistricts. The proposed zoning ordinance amendments and zoning map amendments are required pursuant to the compliance guidelines for the multifamily zoning districts, as most recently amended through August 17, 2023, issued by the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. One of the McMods is located adjacent to and in the vicinity of the Greenbush Commuter Rail Station location in the Braintree Weymouth Landing, and 3 of the McMods are adjacent to and in the vicinity of the Braintree Red Line Station location on Ivory Street in South Braintree Square. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mayor Kokoris?
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I just want to take a moment to thank staff for working on this, and being in compliant, up to date. One of the reasons why you don't see the landfill across from the MBTA station, which is probably one of the greatest locations you could utilize the zoning for, is because it's restricted. We worked to try to get the state to allow us to include that, and unfortunately, even with a number of conversations back and forth, that piece is restricted. But even with that being said, it can be unrestricted through legislative process and some other means, and that's something that, you know, I would recommend you look at down the line. But as far as the plan that's before you, as it was developed by staff, staff looked at areas that were in need of redevelopment, such as Armstrong Cork, and some opportunities in the square area, and tried our best to stay away from historic locations, etc. So as you see the different mappings, there's some limits as to the number of units on some of the parcels as well. I think it was designed in a way that would minimize impact in areas that would create some issues in residential areas and utilize areas that need redevelopment. So I just want to thank staff for all the hard work that was put into it. This particular zoning started out as 15 units per acre, and then it was interpreted by the housing folks at the state level to be much more than that. So the 25% requirement is something that came later on and evolved, and here we are with an opportunity to be in compliance. And I think that as much work and thought went into this to make sure that the impacts weren't going to be as great as they could have been if we used other areas of the town to do the zoning. So once again, I want to thank you guys for all the hard work you did, the staff, and look forward to the discussion and eventually whatever the final outcome is. And thank you for giving me the time to speak today. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mayor Kokoris. And Director Santucci-Rossi, I keep putting this a little too close to me. If you could please give an overview on the proposal, that would be appreciated.
Yes, I would love to, Madam Chair. I prepared a brief PowerPoint, and I will run through that, and then obviously we can get into questions as needed. So just introducing who's here tonight, just on our side and for the members of the public. I am Melissa Santucci-Rossi, the director. Connor Murphy to my left is the assistant director, and Crystal Huff, our town solicitor. We've been sort of the internal team working through different matters related to MBTA communities as they have come up. So the presentation this evening goes over a few different items. We're going to cover what is MBTA 3A. We're going to cover the compliance requirements. We're going to review the 4 districts. We're going to go over the model results and summary, and then we'll get into questions and options. So the first slide, what is an MBTA community? And this particular language here was taken right from the statute, which is a section of the Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 40A, and this particular section is 3A. And in summary, what Mayor Kokoris had touched on was that we need to create zoning that is by right for multifamily housing that's suitable for families, and we need to have a minimum density of 15 units an acre. And the first caveat, the second caveat is that it's not located more than a half a mile from a commuter rail station, subway station, ferry terminal, bus station, if applicable. And we'll see further on in the presentation this evening how the guidelines have changed some of those things. The second matter here, the MBTA community that fails to comply with this section should not be eligible for funds, and they call out 3 separate funds that we're going to talk about later on also in the presentation. And then C, which is really the key part of this, is the Department of Housing and Community Development, which is now known as the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, in consultation with the MBTA and the Mass DOT, shall promulgate guidelines to determine if an MBTA community is in compliance with this section. And those were the guidelines that we had referenced in the legal notice as most recently amended this August, in fact. So what does being an MBTA community mean for Braintree? So on the right side of the screen, we have a map there. And if I could draw people's attention to the darker blue area, those are rapid transit communities. And you can see Braintree is sort of the southernmost blue section, just south of Quincy and Milton. And we are classified as a rapid transit community. We have both Red Line service here and commuter rail service. So we are in a group with 12 other communities as shown in blue on this map. And what does that mean for Braintree? It means that Braintree needs to create zoning. And I want to be clear that this is an effort to create zoning. There is no requirement by the state to build a single unit, in fact. I mean, I think the goal is that once the zoning is in place, units will actually be produced and built, but this is not a production requirement. It is to create zoning that enables the production of 25% of our year-round dwelling units. So here in Braintree, we have 15,077 year-round dwelling units, and that's from the 2020 census. And 25% of that is 3,769 multifamily dwelling units. If you see in the table there, I've highlighted in the blue color that we're rapid transit. The most recent compliance measure was our action plan, which we did submit in January of 2023. So we are considered compliant today. And the next sort of measure is December 31st of 2023, at which point we need to submit to the state our zoning bylaws, ordinances, and proof that those have been adopted locally. This slide is a slide that just kind of caps, there's been a lot of discussion about, what are these grants that they say that we're not going to be able to get, and what does that mean for Braintree? So this slide just essentially outlines the paragraph that I read in the previous slide, and then it lists a whole bunch of different grant programs. In the first section are programs that they're going to consider whether or not you're in compliance. So it's not a hard no for those particular grant programs, but similar to many other state funding programs, they have other criteria and things that they look to when they weight projects, and they try to pick the most advantageous projects in these particular programs. The second part of the slide talks about the three programs that I had mentioned that were in the actual statute, in the 3A statute. So these, you become ineligible for these monies if you are not compliant with Massachusetts General Laws 40, Chapter 40, Chapter 40A, Section 3A. That was a typo. The Housing Choice Initiative, as described by the governor in message in general court, dated December 11, 2017. The Local Capital Projects Fund, established in Section 2EEEE of Chapter 29. The third program is the Mass Works Infrastructure Program. That might sound familiar to some folks here this evening. And then the final one is the one-stop application, Community One Stop for Growth, which several programs fall under that one. And then I've just highlighted on the bottom, the town of Braintree has received $2.5 million in mass work grants, 800 plus or minus in municipal vulnerability preparedness grants, 35,000 in land use planning grants, and the Braintree Housing Authority receives about $225,000 annually. So these grants were all, I'd say, in the last two or so years that the town has received. So we can see it's not small money that the community is accessing through these grant programs. So now we can get into compliance, and we're going to get into some numbers and some maps and things like that. So as noted previously, the town is classified as a rapid transit community, meaning there's at least one rapid transit stop within the town's boundaries. As we know, we have the Red Line station that also is serviced by the commuter rail, and also we have our Greenbush station, which is serviced by commuter rail. Braintree must then comply with the unit capacity, land area, density, and percentage of units and land within the transit area requirements. So if we look to the table to the right of the screen, again highlighting the total number of year-round dwelling units, which is the 15,077. We have the multi-family unit capacity, which is 25% of that number, which is the 3,769. We have a requirement to have at least one district that has 50 acres in it. We need to have 50% of our total district area within a half mile of the stations. And we need to have the also 50% of the unit capacity also in that half mile area. And then the minimum gross density, which is dictated in the statute, again, is the 15 dwelling units per acre. So what did we do? So we started to look at the maps, we started to look at the stops, we started to look primarily at areas that first and foremost already allowed for multifamily housing. So what we did was we took a stab at creating 4 overlay districts. And MBTA Communities Multifamily Overlay Districts, people have been calling it McMod. I will refer to it as McMod this evening in different parts of the presentation. That will be designated as the town's MBTA districts, where multifamily will be allowed as right. Again, the sub-districts must total 50 acres in size, and 50% of that needs to be contiguous. At least 50% of the district acreage must be located within a half mile, and no single district can be smaller than 5 acres in size. So some additional requirements, a lot of requirements, a lot of caveats that sort of come along with this modeling. So what we have come up with is 4 districts, MBTA 1, which is the red line north, MBTA 2, which is the red line south, MBTA 3, which is the red line village in South Braintree Square, and then MBTA 4, Greenbush, Braintree, Weymouth Landing District. So for those folks that are here this evening, or those that are watching at home, you, if you're a noticed abutter, you received a letter that included the legal notice and also a map with a district number on it, noting that your property is either in one of those districts or you are you are a party of interest within 300 feet to one of those districts. So let's get into the districts a little bit. This is the first district, the proposed MBTA District 1, red line north, and we have a map there that the area is highlighted in blue, and then if you can see behind that, you see sort of a circle, a faint circle, and that represents the half-mile radius from the red line stop on Ivory Street. This district's 48.94 acres, and we've also listed the parcels that are in this particular district. So I would describe this basically as north of Union Street, Marketplace to Function Dealership, the Atrius facility, the 2 office buildings on Grossman Drive, and then Daddy's Dairy property is in there as well. And then there's 1 property across the street, which is the Motel 6 property. The second district that we're proposing, which is our largest district, shown here on the map in pink, magenta, and you can also see very faintly the half-mile circle, again, the radius from the Red Line station. This district is our largest district, just over 127 acres, and you can see the listing of all the parcels in that district. This district is best described as all of the property on the, south of the train station along Ivory Street, crossing over Pearl Street, and also running down John Maher Highway on both sides, including the Shaw's Plaza, Ivory Plaza, Pearl Plaza. I still call it Bugaboo, but where Jake and Joe's and Chateau is located, and then on the other side of the street, the large piece is Jonathan's Landing. And then just as we get to the end of John Maher Highway, we also have included the Armstrong Cork piece, which is the large piece you see there between the yellow and the train tracks. Moving into our third district, which is the Red Line Village. This is a district that's our smallest district, 9.43 acres. And this district I would describe as sort of anchoring South Braintree Square. It's the properties down Crescent Ave and the properties, a lot of commercial property just past the Walgreens Pharmacy, shown in magenta on this map. Trying to preserve sort of the small scale in the square, the storefronts, some of the more improved areas, but really trying to, again, anchor the square with some residential units. And then you can see the parcel listings as well. And then our fourth and final district is the MBTA 4, which is the Greenbush, Braintree, Weymouth Landing District, shown here in yellow. Just to be clear, there's a lighter green color also on the map. Those areas are actually open space areas, so those are not included in the district. We've had some questions about Watson Park, not included in the district. So focusing on the yellow, this particular district essentially mirrors the Braintree Weymouth Landing district that was created about 10 or so years ago. And what we did here was we extended it all the way down the water side of Allen Street. We do have some development that was recently approved on Allen Street, and there's some additional opportunity as well as you move further away from Quincy Avenue. These are smaller parcels and listed again on the left side of the slide. So after we've sort of picked out these particular areas and started looking at what is going to work for these particular areas, we also need to make sure that they meet those basic caveats of certain minimum size requirements, meeting the 50-acre requirement for one of the districts. And as you can see here in the slide, all 4 of the districts meet the 5-acre requirement, and we do have one district that meets the 50-acre requirement. So then we get into the compliance model. And the compliance model is an Excel model that was created by consultants working in conjunction with the state, that you essentially input all different kinds of zoning parameters into an Excel spreadsheet, and it spits out a number and tells you this works, this doesn't work, etc. Actually a very exciting exercise, believe it or not. It might not sound it, but for planners it was very interesting to be able to participate in testing these districts. So as you can see here, going across the top, we have each of the districts listed, and then as you run down the bottom, we have your basic zoning criteria, which is minimum lot size, building height, lot coverage, open space requirements, setbacks, parking spaces per unit, dwelling units per acre, and then the lot area per dwelling unit, which is just math dividing the size of an acre by the dwelling units. So what we did in this particular, and how we arrived at these, is we looked at some of the existing zoning that was in place, and I'm going to start with the village, MBTA 3 Village and MBTA 4 Greenbush, and looked at those zoning requirements and tried to closely mirror as best as we could what the village allows for, because we've had several projects developed under that ordinance, and then what does the Braintree Weymouth Landing District provide for. In this particular case, in MBTA 3 Village, we bumped the stories from 3 stories to 4 stories and held the height at 50 feet. So while we've added a story, we haven't changed the height requirement, so the buildings will likely be in line with a lot of the buildings that you already see that were recently constructed in the village. We've actually reduced the lot coverage. The lot coverage there now is very liberal, so we've added some additional green space. We've put in an open space per unit requirement of 150. The setbacks in the village overlay now can be waived to 0 by the planning board, so we've put 5-foot requirements in all of those. We took a look at the parking requirements, and right now our bylaw requires 2 spaces per unit. We have a variety of different projects down there that have been built, and we've kind of been monitoring them, watching them. Some of them have gotten variance relief, some of them were monitored and came back and reduced the parking requirements because it wasn't being used. So we've dropped the 2 space per unit down to 1.5 spaces per unit, also keeping in mind that this is direct walking connection to the Red Line station. And the dwelling units per acre, maximum in this district is 35, and that number was derived by looking at some of the variances that have been recently granted by the Zoning Board of Appeals and some projects that have been built that we'll talk about a little bit later in the slides as some examples to demonstrate that this density has in fact been constructed in South Braintree Square and has been successful. Let's move over to the Landing District. And again, the Landing District is a newer district. It allows for multifamily by special permit now, and it allows you to exceed the height also by special permit. You can go to 5 and 6 stories down in the Landing. I did an inventory of the buildings down there. The older buildings are 3 stories. All of the new stuff that you've seen built on both the Braintree and Weymouth side is 4 and 5 stories. There might be one that was actually 6. People take advantage of topography, 4 stories from the front, maybe 5 in the back, using things to their advantage to try to maximize and remove surface parking and taking advantage of topography, which we hope people continue to do. The Landing, we also increased the open space a little bit. The setbacks down there, again, very liberal existing. We held the same that we held in the Village. The parking requirements, I know that there's been a lot of concerns about parking down in the Landing. The parking requirements now for residential units is 0.8. I think we can all agree that is not enough. We have some parking data from Landing 53 and what the actual usage and what the actual demand for parking in that building is, and that's where we came up with the 1.25 spaces per unit. So looking at what's actually happening there, studying what's been built in the community, and using that to create the zoning. Seeing what worked, what didn't work, and expanding upon those. Now I'll move over to the MBTA 1 North, which is essentially the marketplace, and we've held the this area is all zoned currently highway business and allows for multifamily by special permit. We held the lot size, we held the height, the lot coverage we lowered a little bit. We have 500 square feet of open space per unit. The setbacks, I think those are almost the same. We might have tweaked them a little bit. And then again, lowered the parking from 2 spaces per unit to 1.5. And we have a 30 dwelling units per acre in this particular district. These districts are bigger, the parcels are bigger, and the projects can be bigger. And I think that there is a distinction between density and just large, big projects, and that density can be very thoughtful and designed very well to integrate into a built environment, and just trying to be sensitive that when we have these larger parcels, we're really not looking for large developments, massing, and large buildings. And that goes the same for the MBTA 2 South. Most of these, I think all of these properties except for one are zoned commercial. So holding that 25,000 square feet, holding the height, decreasing the lot coverage for more open space, same setbacks, same parking, and same density. So looking for some consistency. I'll describe it as Grossman's and Ivory Street corridor, as those areas are a little bit more commercial in nature. The roadways accessing those areas are a little bit larger. There's a different vibe driving, in South Braintree Square versus driving along Ivory Street, and really trying to translate that into these districts. Okay, so now we get into the real fun stuff, where the compliance model takes all of your numbers and spits out this wonderful table that tells you, yes, Braintree, these districts with these zoning parameters will produce X number of units. And one thing that I want to point out to everyone here is this is not a simple math exercise. This isn't, I have a 10 acre site, and I have 30 units per acre, and 10 times 30 is 300. The model, which uses Mass GIS layers, that contains a lot of different layers, environmental layers, different restrictive layers, ownership layers. So the model goes in and pulls out land that we're going to call excluded. And that is things that are owned by the town, things that are owned by other governmental agencies, religious uses, schools, wetlands, floodplain, resource areas, and things like that. So that is all factored in. And again, something goes on in behind the computer. And so that's why you're not getting those straight numbers that you would see here. So if we follow down and then sort of across, the important column is the totals column, and the most important number is the unit capacity. So the unit capacity, again, we had to be over 3769. We're at 3922 based on the zoning parameters. And as you can see, once the model pulls out land and does what it does, if you look at the bottom row where it says dwelling units per acre, those numbers are much less than the numbers that I presented in the previous slide, because the model is pulling out land area that cannot be developed on. Okay, and I apologize for the table being so small. All of this information is already posted to the town website, so anybody can pull it up on their phone. They can look at it after the meeting. You don't have to ask for the slides to be posted. We already posted it this afternoon. So what is allowed in the proposed MBTA community multifamily overlay districts? Well, obviously housing is allowed, multifamily housing, and it is allowed by right, meaning you cannot require a special permit. And I've included an example here. This project was recently permitted. Crystal, myself, Connor worked really hard on this particular one here. This is the old Beld site on Allen Street. And this is going to be 56 units mixed income, and it translates into 38 units per acre. And just including a little rendering from the site plan. So just trying to give people some examples of, what does this look like and what can this look like? And this is one that would fit very nicely in other parts of the landing district as well. The other thing that we've done with the ordinance in these sub-districts is we have allowed mixed-use projects also by right, putting forward the uses that people and the residents want to see in the community coupled with residential uses. And just quickly kind of running through this, we have the housing up at the top, the residential uses. We have some institutional uses, community centers, congregate living, which is assisted living, municipal parks, schools, museums. We have recreational uses for areas in the landing and others, boathouse, marina, club or lodge. And then we get into the business uses, which is the bulk of the table, where we have a place of assembly or amusement, animal clinic or hospital, animal retail, animal grooming, full-service animal establishments, banks, body art establishments, professional business offices, catering services, commercial recreation, daycares, fast food with drive-through, fast food without, hotel or motel, drive-through for non-food uses, freestanding kiosks, medical, office park, restaurant, retail, shopping center, function conference facilities, and brewery with tap room. And as you move across the districts, you'll see some of the districts allow these by right, and some allow them by special permit. And the important thing is, and two distinctions here, regardless of what the other uses are, the residential is by right all day. That even if it's coupled with a special permit use, and a mixed-use development, the special permit is only pertinent to the non-residential use. So I just want to be clear that if it's a function facility with a residential building attached to it, the function facility is the special permit, and the residential units would be by right. And then we have two commercial uses. We're still holding on to life science here in Braintree. A research facility, which would be a typical R&D and lab, and then also the light manufacturing, that would be the GMP. And again, looking at the letters there, that's obviously more appropriate for Marketplace and along Ivory Street, but obviously isn't going to make sense in the landing or in the village. So looking at the areas, looking at what's there now, looking at the street network, looking at the ability to park these things, compatibility with adjacent uses, we think we've come up with a table that makes sense, that really tries to promote not only residential units, which is the goal of the statute, but also mixed use as well. This is another example of something that was constructed recently, an example of something that would be allowed in the McMod. This is 2 French Avenue and 84 Pearl Street, the multifamily and a 2-family, and the developer was William Fraser of Fraser Pearl Street Realty Trust. And this particular development is 15 units total, and with 2 affordable units and 35 units per acre. So this slide was used to just demonstrate that density doesn't mean big and massing and overpowering. This is very reasonably scaled, and we've received a lot of comments and compliments from the community on this particular project here. So again, noting the town already has a lot of multifamily residential development at these densities. The town has given out variances over the course of a variety of years. We have a multitude of other projects, older projects that, believe it or not, are probably denser than some of the new ones. These were some other examples that I found. I spent a lot of time researching and looking. The picture on the left, the beige building, which I think is actually a pretty attractive building, looks nice on that corner. That's actually in Melrose, Massachusetts, near one of their transit stops. That's 1 level of retail with 3 levels of residential above. And that building's 21 units. That lot's actually 5,000 square feet, if anyone can believe that or not. I just noted higher density than the McMod. But an example of what a 4-story, first-floor retail building could look like. And then the picture on the right is actually from Cranston, Rhode Island. That's a mixed use with 74 units. That density is 39 units per acre with first floor retail. Looks like they have a roof deck and some other accommodations up on top. So just a couple examples, just trying to give people a visual of massing and size, and just trying to demonstrate that this doesn't mean density doesn't necessarily mean big. It can, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. Couple other examples. The one on the left is an example from Waltham, Massachusetts. That's a mixed-use building, 1 level of retail, 3 stories of residential above. There's some buildings in Braintree that have sort of that mansard style. So I thought that was a good example to show. You can see the nice storefronts and roof line and whatnot, highlighting the retail with some signage. And that site was just over an acre, so that's a much higher density. But again, just showing the elevations for perspective. And then on the right side, that one was actually up in Billerica, Massachusetts. They're leasing out the retail areas now. That's a 3-story, 6,000 square feet of retail. 2 stories residential above, and with 10 for sale condominium units. So there's a variety of things that can be done and a variety of different styles that can be built. So what's next for tonight? That concludes my presentation. I can go over any questions if there's anything from the board members that want me to maybe highlight anything, or we can just get into questions.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the presentation and the overview of the proposal. I think what might make sense next is to go into public comments and questions so we can get things answered as we go along. So this is a public hearing. I'm going to ask people who have comments or questions, invite them to come up to the podium. If you come up to speak, please say your name and your address for the record. There's not going to be a time limit on comments, but I'm going to ask to keep them relevant to the proposal that's here and to just be respectful of other speakers. So, thank you.
Good evening, members of the Planning Board and Director. Job well done. I feel like I'm really loud here. For a change.
Yes, thank you.
46 Hollis Ave, Braintree. Nice presentation. Thank you very much for taking the time to kind of walk through all this. I feel like we're talking about a tidal wave that's about to hit. So we got to prepare ourselves for that, and I appreciate all the thoughtfulness and all the education that you're providing tonight, and we'll be moving forward. A few questions I would ask would be, we're going to have to adjust our infrastructure to accommodate what we saw, 25% additional housing being proposed anyway. And what are the plans to accommodate infrastructure? Water, sewerage, schools, roads. How many students do we anticipate adding to the schools? How many residents do we anticipate in what time frame? Those types of things, so we could prepare for that as a town, as a group. And what would the anticipated cost be associated with those infrastructure improvements? That's my very specific question, and I'm not certain we can actually do that. In terms of, now anyway, in terms of building style, I'm not certain how we negotiate with developers with things of that nature, but I would highly encourage staying away from the stick buildings, the new way of providing residential architecture. The picture that the director showed, the first picture on the left with the tan building or whatever that was, that's nice. I like I like what I call the quaintness quotient to be high. And if we're going to add, this type of construction and housing to Braintree, I'd like it to be as attractive as possible. And I agree, the development over behind Campanelli's, it was very well done. Best development in Braintree, and I think that developer is in the room tonight. Yes, he is, right back there. Shake his hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Mr. Moore, I know you gave your address. I'm not sure you said your name, so just because I know Louise is taking minutes. Kelly Moore. All right, thank you. And I guess this might be a good point to just pause for a second. Director Santucci-Razzi, could you go through what happens if the zoning gets in place? Because I know that you worked hard to incorporate some of the site plan. So the zoning gets in place, somebody submits an application, and what would the process look like? Because I know that you worked on some of the site plan overview in there.
Yes, if I may, through the chair. So the site plan review process is essentially identical to the process that we have in place now. It would bring in, our traffic bylaw is still applicable. I know that's something that has come up in other discussions. It's essentially what we do today. So anybody that has been in front of the planning board or watched any hearings, it's still a very diligent process. It just doesn't have that discretion level. If there is something major in which the project does not comply with a particular section of the ordinance, then there would be an opportunity for that project to not move forward. But essentially, it's still a pretty involved process. Anyone that's watched any of our meetings can see the level of detail that we get into. That's called out in the zoning bylaw in Article 711.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, and then we'll go back to public comment questions. So again, just say your name and address when you come up to speak.
I am Janet Kearney, and I live at 15 Woodsum Drive, which is the Hawthorne condos. I have some concerns. Like you're talking about the area on Ivory Street, Pearl. Have any of you gone through there past McDonald's at lunchtime? It's almost impossible to get through. And I drive to work every day over at Shaw's. Now you're talking about possibly putting in more housing, which means congestion is going to be even worse. The same could be said probably for Grossman as well, because it has been very difficult and have had people complaining online about just being able to get off the highway to get to the Rotary. Then the other concern I have is you're busy touting about, oh, we're going to have like 1.5 parking spots. What happens if most of the families that live in there have 2 cars? Now, where are those people going to park? Probably in the private neighborhoods around the place. Now, that becomes a headache for those people because now they got strangers parking in front of their house, maybe blocking their driveways. So I have concerns with that. The other concern is, as the gentleman brought up before, was the infrastructure. We're going to need more police, more fire. We're going to need better roads, better traffic control, better schools. We're going to need bigger schools, possibly. We're going to need probably a lot of other services. Just because these places, well, I kind of get out of the way, but it's just, as he said, what's that going to cost us? Our taxes are already going through the roof. And it's ridiculous that I moved here because I like towns. I don't want a city. We're going to start looking like Quincy. We're going to start looking like Weymouth is looking now. I lived in Weymouth for over 20 years. I don't recognize the place anymore. There's so many ugly housing there now. This modern stuff it's ugly. Just plain and simple, it is ugly. And this is what we're going to have in our place. Oh, and so you know the ones there behind Campanelli's, number one, they built it. They took over all the parking that was for Campanelli's. Where are those people parking now? The same with the people living in those buildings are running into parking problems because if they leave, somebody else grabs their parking spot. And you may want to have an inspection of the buildings because I just heard that people are experiencing all kinds of problems with those buildings now. So maybe we need to also double check the quality of the builders and what's being done. Because if they start falling apart, why have them? That's my main concerns. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Richard Wenzel. I live at 74 Spring Street. I would like to compliment the planning board on this presentation. Very, very well done as far as it goes. It's about 25% of what is needed for a complete plan. There is no mention of infrastructure, whatever. If you have been on Pearl Street at between 11 and 2, or actually between 11 and 7 in the evening, you'll find almost gridlock on Pearl Street. This project that you have will add to that. There are no provisions in this plan for water or sewerage. Not so much sewerage as it is water. We have 2 other communities that use Braintree's water supply. We don't have any idea as far as what those communities are doing with respect to their building or whatever they're doing. I think that really needs to be looked at as well when we're looking at this plan. Another issue that I have in particular is with the mention in the Greenbush area where you're talking about building heights of between 5 and 6 stories. That's awfully high. Why do we have to go that high in that particular area? Someone mentioned that we're going to look like Quincy. I debate that whether we'll look like Quincy, we'll look more like Boston. Another issue that I think we have is with police and fire. Are we going to have to add police officers and firemen to the town's budget? We've already got a pretty high town budget as it is. I think really those things need to be looked at, and then let's come back and look at what we're doing with respect to the MBTA plan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, good evening. Thank you to the Planning Board for all the work that you've done and for your presentation. My name is James Miller, and I live at 55 French Ave. So my neighborhood is directly behind one of the proposed zones, I think specifically Zone 2, the one directly south of the MBTA station. In fact, the back of my second floor looks out across the zone. Just to put that in context. But I am here to express support for these zoning amendments. It is my understanding that the zoning in these areas has not been significantly updated in years, if not decades. As a result, I believe they are currently zoned for some uses that are no longer appropriate in 2023. In light of recent events like the Clean Harbor incident, we must ensure we are being thoughtful about zoning and the location of specific businesses and facilities in town. So these proposed zoning amendments, I think, are appropriate and smart. This housing would take advantage of both the MBTA station and its proximity to shopping and other amenities, allowing it to be revitalized into a living, commuting shopping center. As we consider and carry out Braintree's new 10-year master plan, this seems like a great opportunity for us to breathe new life into one of the main gateways to our town and support local businesses. Developing housing in these areas would also provide a significant source of tax revenue for the town. As residential property tax, I imagine it would be more durable and sustainable than other sources of tax revenue. I'm not an expert, but I imagine retail and other commercial facilities are more susceptible to changes in their market and the overall economy. Businesses and stores may move or close, but housing will always be needed in our area. One concern that I've heard is traffic. Again, I'm not an expert, but I believe that thoughtfully designed housing and parking would not increase traffic as significantly as one might expect. When my husband and I moved to Braintree, we did not have a car for over one full year, and we still only have one car between us. He works in Boston and I work in Quincy. That's the beauty of these locations. You can walk to the MBTA station, a grocery store, primary care and medical offices, dentists, a veterinary office, the library, town hall, and numerous shops and restaurants. I believe people would be attracted to Braintree for these amenities, and they would take advantage of the public transportation and the walkability of these areas. This would support a vision for Braintree to be greener and more sustainable without significantly impacting existing neighborhoods. Members of the Planning Board, please support these smart zoning amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot of people out there. Anybody else who has any questions or comments?
Hi, Genevieve Downey, Columbus Ave. I live in Zone 2.
Zoning district, you're adjacent to it, so you received a notice.
Okay.
So your property isn't affected by the
So on
zoning.
either side of John Maha Highway you're talking about, which is Hammett's Place, the old Hammett's Place strip.
Exactly, I'm
Will
familiar
there
with
be a
that.
building there?
This is not a proposal to actually build anything.
But that is
So
one of the zones.
it is one of the
within.
zones, that's part of a
Okay, well,
338.
my neighborhood is right beside it, and our dead-end streets abut that. Are they going to be open for traffic for them to come in and out? I mean, is what I'm saying. Are my
From
streets?
Hammett's Place?
Yes, if there's building there, yeah.
No, the Hammond Place area, the width of it is, and all of that land that's Hammett's Place is part of Jonathan's Landing condominium development. So unless the condominium development decides they want to do something else.
Yeah, right.
Frankly, I wouldn't see units being constructed
Oh, I
in
thought I
that
was
little
looking at
strip.
that area in pink.
Yes, I'm familiar with the pink area, but you live up here.
I live right here.
Yes,
And every one of our streets right here,
exactly,
these
but,
dead ends, the dead ends.
but Hammett's isn't like, there's no vehicle connection from this development there.
I'm trying to put two and two together, okay, and we're gonna go up to the highway through
Yeah.
our roads.
Yeah, I really don't see that happening. If, that would be a subdivision, if they wanted to create new streets, would be under a completely different form of application. In addition, that the river's there, and there's a ton of wetlands that run
Right
at the
behind
end,
our houses,
yes.
yes.
I'm very familiar with that area.
And I
Yes.
have another question. And as for the old Carter Rice building across from the transfer station, why is that not part of it? I mean, I heard that there were
It is.
problems. I'd like to know what the issues are with that
Carter
property.
Rice is in the district.
It is?
Yes, it
within
is.
Oh, I thought there were problems that could be run into because it's, according to the mayor, when he made his,
Oh, the mayor was talking about the landfill, ma'am.
the landfill. Oh, beside the transfer station?
Correct.
Where all the solar, oh, in between Pearl Street and the transfer station. This, I'm not following where you're talking about.
We're talking about the landfill the mayor is talking about the landfill being excluded, which is not Carter Rice. Carter Rice is on the opposite
That's
side.
what I'm saying. I thought that's what he was saying, was that area was not considered.
I'm not sure I follow, ma'am. All I know is Carter Rice is in, the landfill's out.
Okay, well, the landfill makes sense, yeah. Is the landfill area where all the solar panels are?
Yes, it is.
So you'll be taking down solar panels if this is part of it?
Ma'am, it's not part of it. It's not part of the
Oh, yeah, it's the
district.
landfill, all right,
Yeah.
sorry. I'm trying
No,
to get
that's
all this
okay.
together.
No, that's okay. That's okay. It's all good.
Okay, and a lot of people ask questions about infrastructure. Have we already worked on numbers? I do appreciate your presentation. It was very well informative.
Thank you. I do not have responses to the infrastructure items this evening. I will
Okay.
gather that data from the department heads that deal with those particular
great.
disciplines.
All right, thank you.
Good evening. I'm Wayne Dennison. I do not live in Braintree. I live in Duxbury, Mass, actually. I'm a lawyer with the firm of Brown Rudnick, and I represent Messina Enterprises. And Messina Enterprises is probably the most prominent landowner in MBTA 2. Messina Enterprises has immediately developable land, what people refer to as the Armstrong parcel in MBTA 2. The first gentleman who spoke tonight talked about the possibility of a tidal wave. Quite frankly, I don't see it. I sit on the planning board in Duxbury. I'm actually the chair of the zoning board in Duxbury. I don't see a tidal wave in part because of the thoughtful way in which your planning department decided to do its overlay district. Many of those parcels in your overlay districts are already fully commercially developed and tenanted. For instance, some of the properties that are within MBTA 2 that are owned by my clients have 30-year leases in place. That property is not going to get developed, at least in the near term, with residents. What this act, the MBTA Communities Act, was intended to do was to provide some additional opportunities for the provision of residences in a commonwealth where there's a real shortage of housing. The place that is best suited for that in your town is in MBTA 2. It's the Armstrong parcel. That parcel is over 30 acres. Not all of it is developable. There's a stream through it now. Maybe 25 acres is developable. But and I actually wrote a letter to the board, and I'm sure you've seen it. The issue that my clients have is that that property will likely not be developed with residences if the maximum project, if the maximum number of units per project stays in the bylaw as it's been addressed. The maximum number of units per project in that district is 325 in the draft bylaw. At 325 over 30 acres, my clients assure me that residential will not be built there. They also assure me that the limitation on the height of these projects to 4 stories is not going to be a tenable way to produce housing. First of all, if you were to put a separate parking garage up under the draft bylaw, that could only be 3 stories. Those parking garages are never going to be built. The cost per space of a 3-story parking garage, you're not going to get separate parking structures. So what you're going to have for residences is likely podium construction with parking under, and it provides you the opportunity to deal with the parking issues, to deal with the trash issues, to deal with the storage issues. So effectively what that means is that a 4-story limitation is actually a limitation to 3 stories of residential housing. We have, and that's not going to be a financially viable model for which we believe developers will be interested in putting residences in. So we have made some suggestions. We've made very limited suggestions as to how we would suggest that that the bylaw be tweaked. And I am talking about tweaks. Rather than the 4-story limitation, we were proposing a 5-story over a first level parking. So 6 total, but 5 residential over the first level parking. And the removal of the 325 project cap. We think that those just 2 small tweaks would in fact provide for the kind of housing and quite frankly, the kind of redevelopment of the Armstrong parcel that would be in the best interests of the town. Thank you for hearing from us. We're happy to answer any questions. Obviously, we had already sent in a letter that reflects what I had said. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kelly Moore, 46 Hollis Ave, Braintree. So then the previous speaker brings up a very interesting point. Well, first of all, I don't see how 3,900 housing units is not a tidal wave. It's 25% more of the housing stock we have today. However, he just mentioned that developers may not be interested in developing under the current parameters. What are the chances that 3,900 is not, or whatever that number is in that vicinity, is not the real number? In other words, in those districts, there are current buildings that have, 30-year leases, et cetera, that they will not be converted to housing stock. Is that correct?
If I may, through the chair, honestly, it's really hard to determine what is going to be developed, redeveloped, repositioned, added onto with, you know, the goal here, or that what we're tasked with, I should say, is putting this zoning together. What's going to come up and what's going to come up as a project, what's going to be an assemblage project, it's really, we don't know. Okay. That isn't something that we can forecast. I think that we'll see, obviously, some development, and we hope to see some, especially in MBTA 1 and 2, and hopefully in the village area as well. The landing's holding its own for now, but, you know, in time. I really can't answer that question. But, I mean, if I had to forecast, would we ever build the 3922 in this district? I doubt it. That would mean everything was gone, or most of everything was gone,
Right.
and everything was you know.
Okay.
I don't think I'll be around, but maybe some other people might. And who knows, the zoning could change, there could be something else that comes out.
Yeah.
This could be rolled back, they could say, 25 is not enough, do 50%. I mean, who even knew this was gonna be a thing 4 years ago? So, it's really hard to tell what is gonna come up of this, what types of projects, are there gonna be other different sort of state programs that sort of caveat and jump on this back? We're not sure of that.
So that being said, we're not certain where this is all going. This is really to accommodate the mandate from the state, which we get. So for a point of reference regarding traffic and vehicle trips, the national engineering standard is 6 vehicle trips per unit. So if you do that math, we're looking at roughly 26,000 vehicle trips a day within the town, additional. That's a lot. Thanks very much. It's going to be fun.
Thank you.
Hi, I live on Union Street, and I was wondering how all these projects were going to, with that many apartments, are going to affect the traffic, which is horrendous now. And if these are low-income housing, I live about a quarter of a mile from Braintree Village, and I really don't want to see low-income housing. We've got Skyline, Braintree Village, Ridge Arena, and there's a lot of problems in those areas. And that's what I have to say. Any answers?
Circle back to some of the questions at the end also. I mean, we can go over, there is a affordability requirement in the bylaw. It's a 10% requirement. The state guidelines say that you can't have more than 10% as a requirement. And
What
so
about
it's,
the roads, though? Like Union Street, that's a very heavily traveled road. It's going to affect that even more.
Director, yes, please.
So as I had noted earlier this evening, individual projects will be reviewed under site plan review, and they're subject to our traffic bylaw. So when the particular project comes forward, at that point, we would analyze the type of traffic that would be generated by that particular project. Again, I want to emphasize this is not a project, this is zoning. This is not an application to build any particular number of units at any particular location. It is simply zoning. And I need to emphasize that point, because this is not, this bylaw doesn't generate vehicle trips. It's a development that applies under the bylaw that would generate vehicle trips.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Bethany Brown from 8 Rose Ave, and I know this zoning doesn't create buildings, but I would remind you that Fair Housing Act and 151B excludes townhouses from requirements for accessible housing, and I would encourage you not to allow townhouses to be built. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. My name is Mary Mitchell. My address is 418 John Maher Highway, Unit 104. There are a number of us here tonight who live in the Jonathan's Landing complex, and I think most of us would very much like to know, Melissa, when you went through your description, I feel like you barely said anything about what might be happening along that corridor. And there's a lot of waterways there. There's a lot of open space, and I am wondering, I think the yellow line on that map goes along the road, but is there a thought about how much of the area that's currently open space is likely to be developed, particularly on John Maher Highway, adjacent to Jonathan's Landing?
If I may, through the chair to Mary's question. So there are a lot of, and I put the map back up, and I would invite people, again, this is all available on the website as well. It might be easier to zoom in on your phone, or if you want to walk up to one of the screens. But you can see some areas beneath the magenta areas that have some crosshatch, and those demonstrate some resource areas. The river does come down through that and to the corner, near the corner of John Maher and Ivory Street. So there are some resource areas in those areas, and the MBTA zoning does not override any applicable environmental regulations. So the Wetlands Protection Act is still in place, the Rivers Protection Act is still in place, so all of the permitting that would be required by the Conservation Commission is still in play here. And as I had noted previously, we've actually decreased the lot coverage in this area. Currently, you can cover up to 75%. We're proposing a lot coverage in this district of 70%. So that does add 5%. When it doesn't seem like a lot, but 5% is definitely something that's meaningful. And just to Jonathan's Landing, because I do see some of my friends here in the audience and some residents that have known over there for a long time. Your entire parcel is in this, and again, I think that's a perfect example of the reality of, we're talking about this idea of this tidal wave, and then a comment from another speaker that actually it's not going to be a tidal wave, that this is a fully built out, owned, wonderfully managed and operated condominium association with 308 units, I believe. And unless Jonathan's Landing decided that every unit owner was going to get together and somehow start building all these other units, nothing's going to change there. People are going to continue to live there. It's going to continue to be Jonathan's Landing. So I would say that all of that land on the right side of the street, unless Jonathan's Landing wants to do something, is going to stay exactly the same, kind of piggybacking on the comment from the resident from Fountain Street about connecting through. There's a lot of wetlands in that area, and those environmental laws that regulate those areas are all applicable. And I've been getting a lot of questions around that, and I really appreciate the residents making sure that the zoning doesn't implicate the resources in the area.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name's Mike Ling. I'm with the East Braintree Civic Association. I've been addressing issues in East Braintree for over 50 years now. I'm pretty well familiar with that. The other areas I'm not too familiar with, so I can't talk on those. And I have a couple of questions. First of all, I've been sending my comments to Elizabeth Maglio. Anyway, you had mentioned that you're tasked for this. Do they, all of a sudden, do they come up after 2 years and say you're not doing your job, you lied to us, or your plan doesn't work? Do you have a deadline?
If I may, through the chair. So again, we have a deadline to submit the zoning to the state. Once the state receives that, they will review it. They've indicated it will take anywhere from 2 to 4 months for them to complete that review. And then it's on the books. And again, there's no production requirements. There is nothing, I mean, these properties are all owned by property owners, and whether they decide they want to exercise their rights under their zoning, under this new zoning, that's really up to them. But there is no mandate to produce a single unit, and there has been no guidance or anything in the guidelines thus far, which the guidelines have changed quite a few times, that say, we're going to check in 6 months, and if you haven't, built X amount of units. We haven't seen anything of that nature, nor have we heard anything like that from any of our peers or partners. And we've been engaging with the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities as much as we can for guidance. And we've also had technical assistance from RKG and INS Associates through Mass Housing Partnership. So we're trying to use as many resources as we have, and I haven't heard anything about a check-in in the future from the state. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, Director. Could you just go over what happens if the zoning does get voted into place, the approval process afterward that goes through the state? So I think that might be relevant to the question also.
Okay, I'm sorry, can you ask me that again?
So if the zoning gets adopted by Braintree and then it gets submitted to the state by the year-end deadline,
Okay.
Could you explain that approval process?
So another one of our tasks is to have this approved locally, and that is the town council, that is the legislative body. The planning board is simply making a recommendation. Needs to be submitted to the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities by December 31st. Once they receive that, if it's received by December 31st, you are deemed compliant while they're reviewing your ordinance. So if it takes the 2 months on the low end or the 4 months, you're compliant that entire time till they say, hi Braintree, this works or this doesn't work. And we've been vetting things along as we go to make sure that we're, putting in something that has a very high rate of being, quote, accepted by the state. If we do not submit the ordinance by December 31st, then DHCD, let's say it's January 1st, or it's January 10th, or February 15th, whatever the date might be after the 31st, you are immediately non-compliant on January 1st, and you are also non-compliant the entire time they're reviewing your zoning. So there's definitely a benefit to getting it submitted by the end of the year. Definitely.
Now, what happens if you find out that your mandate from the state conflicts with another mandate from the state? And I say that in line with the fact that I was a chairman of the Greenbush Committee for the never-ending Greenbush line. And found out that all the traffic, the major intersections in all that area, all failed. They were all F intersections. So now, and that's before they did all the building in the Weymouth Landing area. And additionally, much of that area that you pointed out in Weymouth Landing is subject to sea level rise. And so it's really not buildable. It's not buildable as far as traffic goes because all the intersections failed. So a developer is going to have to come in there and you're going to start out saying, by the way, you got to do something about the traffic that doesn't work anyway. And by the way, your building's going to sink because you're in flood zone. So what happens when the state comes back? Oh, the other thing I want to mention is that I also work on the bridge project and the gas compressor and pretty much everything. Anyway, Weymouth Landing is the evacuation route for that project area. If something happens in Weymouth Landing, you have either the bridge, which is always stuck in the up position, or you have Weymouth Landing. And if Weymouth Landing is gridlocked, what do you do? So what do you do when you have conflicting problems in these areas? Conflicting mandates from the state. You have to have an evacuation route that doesn't work, that can't work. You got a bridge that doesn't work. but you got to have this, all this housing in there. So what do you do?
Same thing we do today.
Wing it, huh?
Navigate through the state as best as we can. To your point, Mr. Lang, as I said earlier, floodplain is still in play, high water mark, all of that stuff is still in play. That this zoning does not trump any environmental laws. And if there are conflicts and we face some of those now. I mean, we redeveloped the Beld site, and we dealt with a lot of those things, and those particular projects will be subject to other permitting in addition to local permitting. They'll have state permitting that they must comply with depending on where they are, whether it's a Chapter 91 license, waterways. There's multiple jurisdictions the closer you get to the water, and those particular projects will need to do the delicate dance of balancing all the different requirements from the different jurisdictions, and it either might work or it might not work.
Well, my thinking was, what do you do when you submit data to them, knowing that it's not going to work? I'd like to see National Grid out of there, and I looked into that a long time ago, but it turns out you can't build there because they used to store transformers there, and they all leaked, and so it's all contaminated land. So you can't build in that area. But if you submit this data to them, say, this land is good for a 6-story building, but it isn't. What do you do? I mean, if all your
It's
data
not in
is...
the district. That property's not in the
And this works on the idea that maybe there is somebody in the State House that actually reads this material. But anyway, I just wanted to ask you, and obviously I know the answer, so thank you. By the way, that building, I'm glad to see them replacing the building, the Bell building, but the sewage overflow interceptor runs right behind the back there, so that should be a really dynamic project. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good evening. John Fabiano, Putnam Ave. Just have a quick question and a few thoughts before it. I grew up in Charlestown, spent the first 30 years of my life there. And I am in favor of development done right with the proper infrastructure considerations. I think 3,900 is a lot of units, but the Boston comparison that several people make, I think, is hyperbole at best. I don't think Braintree will ever be Somerville or Boston in my lifetime or my kids' lifetimes or lifetimes after that. My quick question is, how many acres is Jonathan's Landing? Does anyone know?
It's about, oh, sorry, if I may through the chair. Yes, actually, sadly, I do know that. So that is, believe it or not, it's about 40 on the right side of John Maher Highway, and they actually own a piece on the other side. It's about 4. It's about 44, plus or minus.
Do you know how much of it is buildable?
No.
Just curious the comparisons between the Township complex and the guy from Duxbury saying that second to 325 and what Jonathan's Landing is and how that seems to be flourishing, and curious how that works.
I don't think there's a very large wetland on that site that has been there, that remains there, that if they worked around the development. I can tell you that that development's about 7 units an acre.
Okay. Nice. And if the draft laws were to be tweaked for Messina, I'm saying we should or shouldn't, but is there a fear that other developers will come forward and ask for changes as well?
Anybody can come forward with comments, sir.
Okay.
Anybody from the public, property owners. We sent notices, we sent over 1,000 notices out to people, including, single-family homeowners, multifamily, commercial buildings owned by businesses, the whole run.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Paul Fenaro from Hunt Ave. In light of the MBTA's shortfall deficit and in light of its huge infrastructural shortcomings, I find it highly ironic that our legislature would be trying to tell us what to do in our backyard when they can't clean up their own. And why you're all swallowing this, I don't know. I do know that at least one town, I watched a town meeting where they were talking about not complying, finding some other source of income. And I think that's something to consider here. I do have two questions. One is, what is exactly meant by restricted when referring to the transfer station?
If I may. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
I can actually also answer your implied question as well, because I think that's important to keep up front of why we're, the consequences of non-compliance here. So the transfer station, or, the old landfill is an Article 97 property. And so it's protected under the doctrine of public trust, and it takes an act of the state legislature to, as well as our local legislature, which is the town council, a vote of the Conservation Commission, and approval of a state agency to remove it out of sort of open space protection. So it has some significant hurdles. So it's certainly not undoable if those are things that have occurred in the past, but it does have some significant hurdles to be able to be removed from protected open space. If I can, just address sort of what the potential consequences of noncompliance could be. We discussed, sort of the loss of funding. The other one is the Massachusetts Attorney General has issued an advisory telling MBTA communities that if they're non-compliant, that they face civil litigation and potentially federal enforcement as well.
You're going to crucify us.
So in one of the towns, and actually I can pull up the her exact language here. So she issued an advisory within the last year on this. The Boston Globe had an article about it as well. And also, one of the towns that has refused to move forward with this is embroiled in a fairly large civil lawsuit right now as well. So there's some real practical consequences for towns to not comply with state law.
So you're between a rock and a hard place. And the other question I have is the development down in East Braintree. Is that at capacity, both residential and commercial? Has it ever been at capacity?
If I may, through the chair. Landing 53, sir?
Well, it's just the Braintree, East Weymouth, the landing.
What, are you asking me about the building, though,
Yeah,
Landing 53?
Yes.
Okay. Fully tenanted commercial. We have the River Shed, which recently closed. We have a new restaurant that's going to be taking that space. They're going to be going through permitting. And then we have the Keller Williams, and we have the veterinarian. And as far as the occupancy of the residential units, the percentage, I don't have that, not that percentage.
Because it would be a question for me is who's going to live? This is a lot of residences. Who is going to live there? Are they people that are going to be taking the T to work in Boston, which nobody seems to be doing anymore?
Again, it's no units in the reality, because nothing has come forward for a project yet. And again, as I said earlier, I mean, I don't want to say never, but the chances of us getting 3,900 units in those districts it's just, again, it's not likely. I think we will have a few strategic projects that, frankly, I think that we need. But as far as where they're going to drive, I mean, I can't answer that question. I think the idea is that they're close enough. There was a gentleman that spoke earlier about him and his household just having one vehicle. And I think, you know, if you come from a household with many cars and things, it's almost not even possible to think that that's even an option. But believe it or not, people do it. And if you look at the area, you can get everything you need by foot, especially in District 1 and 2. And also the Village District. I mean, everything is there. Groceries, food, alcohol, hairdressers, nails, diners, restaurants. It's endless. But those specifics, I mean, I can't answer how people are going to get to work and whatnot, sir.
And whether we can fill those buildings. So I'd like everybody here to realize that this is part of a global initiative to develop around T stations and transportation, and it's called Agenda 2030. It's a United Nations initiative, and it's designed basically in the long run to take you away from your property and put you into stack housing in urban areas. They won't win. Thank you.
Hi, okay, that is loud. Hi, my name is Rob Kadayer of 143 Middle Street. So a lot of what I'm going to say, people have said already. Mainly just the MBTA working as the engine for this, I just think is incredibly flawed. The MBTA is, it doesn't work too well. I mean, I speak from experience, like, just the last time I took it this summer, it took 2.5 hours to get from Logan Airport down to Braintree. In fact, I think this summer there was also a time when there was a news reporter who, as part of his story, rode a bike from Park Street to Braintree and actually got there within 5 minutes of the guy who took the train from Park Street to Braintree. Having the MBTA as the engine running this is essentially like gambling on the Patriots being a competent football team at this point. So the example with the Weymouth Landing, as people have said, that is a pretty big buildup. It's right next to the commuter rail station. However, there is the issue with the parking over there. People just don't want to take the train, and I mean, I honestly don't blame them. Like, the MBTA, if this is how we're running it, the metro in Kharkiv, Ukraine is actually running more effective, and that's 30 miles from the battlefront. So when it comes down to some of these developments, whereas if the state is going to require it, one thing that I would say is just because residential tends to add a lot more burden to the town's budget than does commercial. And in the end of the day, large developments, any development really, like apartments, they're more of a commercial enterprise than residential. I mean, if anybody, like, I would at least like to see that brought to the town council to increase the tax rate for them, because if they're going to be further burdening the town's resources, they should be paying their fair share so that the rest of the town doesn't get stuck with the cost of new development. Now, some of the questions have been raised. Like, I was pretty concerned about the in 2 where there's the wetland. That question was answered, and I was satisfied with that one. I just I'm for more conservation wherever it's possible, to be honest. And one thing that I was wondering to bring up, where I don't know, like, if this is the place for it, if town council would handle this, would be for the acreage that's put aside, would it be possible to zone for or set aside an equal or even double the amount of acreage that will be developed for conservation land somewhere else in the town? Me personally, I always believe that people are generally more relaxed, surrounded by nature versus overly gray and industrial environments. Now, some of the concerns also brought up the style, where if we could go back to the style pictures. Right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Like something like that, I honestly got no problem with, because the thing is, something like that it does fit the aesthetic of the area. It's built to scale. It's not overly big. It's not like the contentious Zom project that there was that me and a few of my friends, we started referring to as Spaceball 1, reference to, shout out to Mel Brooks there. So to the next one.
Yeah.
The one on the left also, I can see its appeal. It's mainly like those, the ones on the right, those are the ones that I feel like really wouldn't fit in Braintree. Like anything like that, kind of like constructivist, kind of almost neo-Soviet, very blocky, almost looks like it's rendered with a Nintendo 64 emulator. Like stuff like that, I just don't think that would fit in the town. So yeah, mainly like the questions I would have would be like, for conservation land, would it be possible to offset any new development with more conservation land?
Director, do you want to take a stab at that one?
If I may, just to clarify, sir, were you talking, you had said earlier, and I wrote down, to zone double the area that these districts would compromise as conservation. So where would you be thinking those? So take somebody's property and zone it as open space?
Oh no, I was just saying like if there was just kind of open space that could just be set aside for like permanent conservation land. I don't really know where that is in the town. I know we got Pond Meadow, we got Cranberry Pond, like anything like that.
Existing open space areas or adding open space areas?
Adding if there is any available open space. Like I said, I don't know if there is any.
I mean, so we have a variety of open space areas in the community. Most of them are owned by the town, so those are already protected. We have other properties in town that are under conservation restrictions, which Crystal had spoke about earlier, like the landfill, those Article 97 restrictions. I mean, if we're looking to add open space beyond what we already have, then we'd be going to a property owner and saying we're going to essentially downzone your property to zero value.
Okay, absolutely against that one then.
What'd you say?
Absolutely against that one then.
Yeah. So it's I understand what you're saying, and I think I was thinking not that extreme as your example, but along those lines, because if you look at the lot coverage requirements in the underlying zoning districts where these are over, you can cover more than the lot in the underlying zoning district. So looking to try to add as much open space in these districts as we could.
Okay. And so, yeah, that was like mainly my concerns. Like I said, they've been addressed here pretty well tonight. Also, Celtics are looking pretty good tonight, so.
Thank you.
Carl Johnson, 17 Brewster Avenue. I have a question relative to the caps that you've placed on, in particular on MBTA 1 Red Line North and MBTA 2 Red Line South. It indicates that the dwellings per unit, dwelling units per acre is 30, which 15 is a minimum required under 30A, under 40A, Section 3A, when it was adopted. But you've placed a cap of 325 units on a parcel which is approximately 50 acres. Could you explain the thought process for doing that?
I can, yes, if I may, through the chair. So yes, looking at sort of the density cap and the densities that we've promoted for each district and going back to this model, where we put in all these various zoning parameters, including the unit cap, and it spits out a number. And if the number is at or over what we need to be at, and our number is 3769, we're producing 3922, that seems to work. So you can essentially back into it through the model. And if you look at this, at the slide that I have up on the screen now, which I explained briefly earlier, that whatever the model is doing behind the scenes when we put all these parameters in, and it starts taking out land that you can't build on and things like that, it adjusts the densities, and the unit cap is figured into that as well. So if you look at 1 and 2, it actually lowers it slightly for compliance purposes. The thought behind it, and I've touched on this earlier, density is one thing, and I've showed some examples, and we've built out some developments in this town that are very dense, but they're reasonable in size and they're reasonable in mass, and the buildings blend well with the existing built environment. Looking at some of the projects that we have constructed in the community, multifamily are larger ones. I think we pushed the envelope at Lenox Farms at 338 units. The 325 is really in that range, and frankly, the 325 is also a number that hopefully is going to also attract not just residential uses, but mixed-use projects. Yep. And understanding that the MBTA zoning is to create residential units, we're really trying to improve the district along the Ivory Street corridor. We've been talking about Ivory Street corridor for far too long, and plopping down a bunch of large residential buildings I really don't think is going to do much. We want sites to have more than one purpose. We want a reason for people to go there. We want people living there. We want people recreating there, eating there, playing there, walking there, and really providing an opportunity for connectivity between a variety of uses along that corridor.
The other question is, how did you arrive at 4 stories for those sites? Because if you're going to have mixed use, which you've always indicated in the Red Line South District, MBTA 2, that implicitly the first level is going to be commercial in some respect, either accessory to the residential or for some other use such as restaurants, etc. If you have 4 stories, then you're going to end up with 3 stories of residential units. And I think that you make the buildings more squat and occupies more land area versus if you had 5 stories there, or if you gave either a special permit or something else for bonus height in those areas that should be based upon the particular conditions of the site and how you've placed your open space and parking. And the biggest thing, you've heard a lot of people talk about their concern about traffic and parking. What you do when you have only, you have smaller buildings, you're going to have an awful lot of parking, even though it's 1.5 parking. You are also, with mixed use, going to have to provide for that commercial space as well. So when you're doing this, I think you should have more flexibility based upon what the development comes through, and not, understanding that the residential component is a use by right under 3A. I do think you should have some flexibility in here, maybe a footnote, so that if the planning board decides via a special permit process that it could award additional height, and also by increasing density perhaps, by increasing open space and other features. In particular, you mentioned the Armstrong site. The Armstrong site is somewhat unique, and by the way, I don't represent the Messina companies tonight. But I'm familiar with that site for many years, more than I like to admit to, I guess. But that it contains some outstanding architectural features with the stone bridge. It has some historic areas in one corner of it. There's been a great deal of money under the state and other projects to create the herring run and take down the dam that's been there for many years. And I see from the progress has undergone, that the water is flowing at this point, and it really looks like they've created a nice waterway feature, which I think it will do some of the things that you mentioned with river walks and so forth, as the town has been trying to do. So I think you should deal with some flexibility in these if you're able to. I don't understand particularly about the model that you've been working with for a while, but I just think in the course of intelligent development, as you've mentioned, you'd like to see that you could think about in those districts that would accommodate it, put that in. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the public? No.
I tend to remember these things after the fact. One of the things I had suggested is that, oh, I'm sorry, Mike Lang, 74 Cotton Ave, East Braintree. Anyway, you know, the intent of this project, this state requirement, is to get traffic off the roads, get the cars off the roads. I would think that you would encourage senior housing in these areas. Senior housing, my people, will reach a point where they no longer need the car or can't drive the car or something to that effect, which kind of eliminates one of the problems, the traffic problem itself. And so I would encourage people, or maybe in the town planning, when you're talking about building more housing for the seniors and all, place it close to this area. That would accomplish what you're after and makes these people happy too. And it would, the neighborhood stores would really develop better. Just my thought. Thank you.
If I may, through the chair briefly, just to remind people, going back to our first slide, first paragraph, not only is the multifamily by right, however, that such multifamily housing shall be without age restriction and shall be suitable for families with children. So senior housing, young, none of that's going to fly in this particular district.
Just to confirm, so that doesn't restrict an application coming in. It just means that we can't require them to do senior housing. So, for example, a developer could come in with a senior housing proposal under this bylaw. They couldn't? No.
No.
Okay.
No. They could come
Surprising
in
to me.
under the underlying zoning district at the 7 units per acre in our regular bylaw, but you cannot do senior housing in this bylaw. No, you cannot. No age restriction.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Hi, Genevieve Downey, Columbus Ave. Somebody brushed on affordable housing and low income. Are these going to be condos, purchased units by individuals, or rental units?
Do you want
Who
to respond?
knows?
Yeah, it depends on what the application is that comes in. It's multifamily.
Yeah, I understand, it's multifamily. Like, I know when Manatequit Village was built, my sister and her husband and her 2 kids, he was a firefighter in Braintree. Beautiful rental property that was gorgeous. Not so much anymore. So I was just checking on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All right. At this point, I thank you all for your comments tonight. I know that we did receive written comments also, and we did review those and receive them, and I appreciate everybody who wrote in, who maybe is watching and talked here tonight. And so at this point, I'll turn it over to the planning board members for their questions and comments as well. Member McCamey, you want to go first?
Do I have a choice? Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a few comments. First, as we know, and again, I'm going to emphasize it, these are state-mandated regulations. But however, what I find interesting is we know what some of the penalties are, but the state has provided no incentives to us, really. Is that true, Director? And what I mean by that is we've heard many comments about infrastructure, but it looks like the state said, well, you got to follow the rules, but we're not going to help you do it.
To date, they have not laid out anything specific to that. They have not even indicated, so they're in as far as the grants, you know, you're penalized. They haven't said, oh, if you are compliant, you'll get extra points or something like that. For example, the Mass Works is a huge grant program for infrastructure for communities. So, you know, I think they're kind of, you know, they put the statute in place, and then they've come up with guidelines, and they continue to, they've tweaked them, what, 3 times already now? Or,
The guidelines?
yeah.
Yes, the guidelines have gone through 3.
Yes, so, you know, will there be something else coming once communities get their zoning in and they get an idea of, okay, what are these towns doing, and what is this really going to put as far as a stressor on these communities that have promoted this zoning and complied with what we've asked them to do? It's hard to tell whether or not they'll issue other grant programs, whether they'll earmark special funds. Okay, we're going to do X amount of transportation for MBTA communities only. It's really hard to tell.
Right. So the conclusion then is
no.
It may change, you know.
Oh, it may change, but nothing
It's likely
right
to
now.
change. Okay. Secondly, in terms of existing projects like the Old Beld on Allen Street, how does that factor into any of this, or it basically doesn't?
Well, it's interesting. The Beld site has a few different caveats. One, it's owned by the town now, so it's technically considered excluded. But because we have purchase and sales and we have permits in place, it's obvious it's residential, so we're able to include that land in the district. Unfortunately, that development was by special permit. So there is no opportunity to demonstrate to the state that we have an existing zone where residential multifamily is allowed by right, because the landing would have been the only thing that was close, but it's still by special permit, and the density bonuses are also by special permit.
Okay, thank you. Another comment is, of course, right around the MBTA, and as many of us probably know, we have an applicant in front of us for the old Motel 6 site. But when I looked at the what you drew out and everything, it seemed, and not to, you know, be conflicting about this or anything, but it almost screams out like that there could be possibly an opportunity for housing there. So when I looked at the map, I know a lot of people say, well, it's not going to, it's too close to the dump and this and that. At the right price, people are going to, you know, rent these places.
To your point, in a response, Member McCamey, zoning is not something like where tomorrow all of a sudden we're going to flick a switch and all these units are going to be there. Things can change. I mean, think of what you thought would never be somewhere 20 years ago. I mean, there's uses now that we didn't even have 20 years ago. So what's going to happen in 2, 3, 5, 10 years? I think all of the areas that we've put in the sub-districts, 1, 2, 3, and 4, are all appropriate for residential. And I think that as you start to see things happen, other things are going to happen on other pieces, and everything's sort of, you know, my favorite line is money follows money. So hopefully people start investing in Braintree and keep investing here.
Okay, there you go. I just thought I'd raise that. My last comment involves comments that I've heard tonight about, you know, I like that style of building, I don't like that style, maybe we should have 5 stories, what's the right density, senior housing, no senior housing, go down the list. My point about it is I think that the staff did a good job setting the standards, and if a developer wants to come in here and offer up a different idea, they can certainly consult with the planning department, and they can certainly present it in front of the board. We've had many projects in this town which have come before us and have exceptions For example, like the Residence Inn over near the plaza. They're built into a rock face basically, and they asked for extra stories, and we gave it to them. That seemed to work out pretty well. The landing apartments, same thing. They sit down. We had another project that came up on Independence Ave. The developer insisted on a 5th floor. He had to take it down because we said no. My point simply is let's have these projects come in front of us. We have standards. If you want an exception, that's why we're here. And we listen project by project. And as far as I can see, it's worked out well. And in my opinion, we should not have the loosest standards. We should have pretty solid standards. And when I look at them as presented by the staff tonight, these are all things that we're familiar with. 4 stories is an example. Great, you want a 5th story? Come and talk to us or present it to the staff, so on and so forth. So I like the standards. And again, just so that the public knows, we go through massive detail on every project. And if somebody wants for something different, present it to us. So that's all I have. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Member Kent?
Well, as usual, Member McCamey's taken a lot of the wind out of my sails. But so again, the town budget is approximately what, 160 million, something like that?
I don't have the figure off the top of my head.
And the
I know mine's very
all right,
little, small amount of that.
I should know that, but the funds that are at risk here, short term, are in the order of 4 or 5 million. Okay, but there's also lawsuits and other stuff that you can't necessarily quantify in that numerical thing. Okay, so the state has concluded that this is good for us, and is state rep here, or the state senator, or reps from the T, or reps from the Healy administration, but nevertheless, that's been, I don't mean to sound so political, but anyway, you have put together, with the cards that we've been dealt, a very solid plan here. And I certainly appreciate that. Nobody's saying there's going to be 3,922 units coming in the next 12 months. This would be a maximum that would be allowed under the plan that's being submitted to keep the state sort of, happy for the short to intermediate term run.
Correct. The
Okay.
3922 is every single district on these maps building out under the zoning parameters that we've put in place.
Yep, okay, all right. And, we could debate the 4 stories or the 3 stories, the 5 stories, but again, as previously mentioned, that would be taken on a case-by-case basis if it ever came to that.
Correct. Nothing in this ordinance, or really any zoning ordinance, precludes somebody from seeking a variance to exceed any of the zoning parameters or dimensional criteria that we've laid out.
Okay.
What Attorney Johnson had mentioned about the doing something by special permit, a lot of communities are starting to move towards doing, in a site plan review context, doing bulk and dimensional relief by special permit in exchange for something. The variance bar is very high. There are communities where you can't get a variance, period. So those communities have taken a different position and said, okay, well, you want this, I want this. And it's a widely used tool. Sometimes it's tied to more affordable units. Sometimes it's tied to more open space. Sometimes it's tied to public amenities. So there's a variety of things that you can do so that it's those exceptions are all evaluated sort of equally in the context of a particular project. So it's essentially a variance, but they're calling it a special permit.
Okay, all right. So, again, continuing the idea of the 3,922 units is, it's not a real number. It is a number that has been presented to comply with the requirement that we've been told we have to comply with.
Correct.
And for anything like that to come forward, all of the properties, somebody said this is 30-year lease with the Shaw's and all that. And yeah, there's a couple of properties, the Armstrong and the warehouses that are underutilized, but many of the spaces that are included in this plan are vibrant and already operating and will be for the foreseeable future.
Yep.
Okay, it's just helpful to have this in context.
Yeah, it's kind of, and I understand that and appreciate that, and the public too, and I've received a lot of comments, like this isn't leveling areas and just all of a sudden we're gonna say, okay, you go over here and do 400, you go over here and do 500. It is essentially the same as any other zoning proposal that we've changed. Until and when somebody wants to do something on a property in that particular district, nothing will happen.
Okay, very helpful, thank you. Almost set.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Member Grove?
Ms. Santucci, Rosie, we had, originally it was a density of 15 units. That changed by how? What was the functional activity that changed that?
Braintree doesn't have 15 units per
No,
acre.
in the state bylaw.
It's still 15, that's the minimum.
Okay.
Yeah, that hasn't changed.
How did the 5-acre and 50-acre designations come into place?
Those are set out in the guidelines, and there's different caveats for different communities, because they went in through the model and figured out some communities, if you look at the half-mile radius, like for example, I'll use the Landing. You draw the half mile, we're in Weymouth. Yeah. So Braintree can't do zoning in Weymouth. So the state went and looked at some of those things and came up with these parameters about you have to have X% within this distance, X amount can be out. They looked at the excluded lands, the environmental areas, and all of those in the land mass within the half mile, and was like, is this enough? You know, can they make this work, or do they need to go beyond the half mile?
Who came up with that, the MCMOD?
No, that's us. We're the MCMOD. That's our overlay. No, the state did.
Did they modify the bylaw?
No, it's the guidelines.
The law?
The law doesn't say much of anything. The law...
I want to know how these changes are happening. You said you had 2 changes in requirements.
The guidelines. So on this slide here in tab C, DHCD, MBTA, and MassDOT are going to promulgate guidelines. And they did, and they've revised them now 3 times.
This is the body that's designated to ensure the compliance of the communities?
Correct.
I have an issue with us chasing a non-legislative body. Did they give you any notice that they were thinking about changing anything?
They've had quite a bit of opportunity through MAPC, through our technical assistance partners, about these things and changes that they were thinking about, and through also like Crystal's Mass Lawyers, professional group, and planners. Like everybody's been talking about this since they started it.
Well, my problem is guidelines aren't enforceable laws.
Yeah, it actually was just litigated, and they found, yeah, so there was actually, are you talking about the KP case? Where they've, I don't want to get too much into that, but there has,
I
yeah,
can
go
make
ahead.
this- If I may, Madam Chair, I can make this pretty succinct, Member Grove, but when you have official promulgated regulations from a state agency interpreting a law that that state agency has been charged to interpret, those guidelines have the force of law.
Yeah.
Yes, but the law, the state law, doesn't ask them to promote standards.
They are the agency that is charged with promoting the guidelines to enforce this law.
I just have a problem with chasing an agency that has nowhere near the same culpability to the community as the House of Representatives. I think you're just asking for trouble by running down that rabbit hole. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Member Sterlazzi?
I want to thank the planning department for all their hard work in putting this in. I just have two quick questions. My first one, I probably already know the answer because we're dealing with the state. But when they were going through this, and I fully understand the circumstances we've gone through over the past 3-4 years, but when they were doing this, they're portraying this as building housing near the mass transit. And did they provide any statistics or projections of what they thought the residents would be using public transportation over their own use vehicles? Like 50% would now be using public transportation instead of driving a car. And I also, I know this is a state, they probably didn't, but wishful thinking. And just wondering because like it came up multiple times, traffic. So, the state saying, hey, from projections from other cities and towns in other states, we've seen that it could be like 30% of the residents are using public transportation, not using their own used vehicles.
I haven't seen that, Member Stolazzi. I mean, I would think that there's some kind of data, and we can ask the question, is there any kind of ridership data that shows, there was some information, it wasn't numbers, but that showed, the further you get away, the less likely, like they say the half mile is really like that sweet spot, and then as you move, it just, but it wasn't specific numbers. But let me see if I can inquire about that and see if they might have something that they just haven't shared, when they came up with
Fair
this
enough.
whole idea.
Thank you. And then lastly, you mentioned that once we are compliant, we submit this before December 31st, and it could be anywhere from 2 to 4 months before they approve it, or they come back with, oh, by the way, you need to fix this or that. What happens to any potential projects that come up or presented to us during that time frame? Like, are we following the guidelines of the zoning, or are we using...
That's an interesting question.
Are we using our old zoning? Like, you say we're in compliant, but if we're missing a piece, that could have a big factor on the development.
So, if I may, Madam Chair, I can answer this kind of broadly. So, you have two issues here. Like, one, what is a validly enacted ordinance in the town of Braintree? And then two, is you're talking about compliance with the MBTA regulations. So once we have validly enacted an ordinance in the town of Braintree, that's going to be the law on the books that people will have to comply with. It's a separate question on whether that law adequately complies with the MBTA communities law for what used to be DHCD, which is now EOHLC, and their regulations. I was talking about this earlier today. It's like Route 128. It's always going to be Route 128 to me. I hate to say that EOHLC is always going to be DHCD to me too. They just changed the name within the last 6 months. It's very confusing. So that's a two-part question. So whatever we enact here, whatever we validly enact pursuant to the procedures that are set forth in Chapter 40A to enact a zoning ordinance that also passes you know, the regulations in our charter on how, you know, our legislative process works here, that would be a valid ordinance, and anyone who came in would follow that valid ordinance. And then it's a separate question, and when it goes through the state process to determine if that ordinance is compliant with the state regulations.
Okay, thank you. And isn't it also 93 and 95 for 128?
See?
No, nothing further, thank you.
Member Conley?
I appreciate the efforts of our staff, and I think it's important that you've noted that there was no production requirement within this process. The question that I did have was, to what extent has the state given feedback on this draft, either in technical meetings or otherwise?
So if I may, through the chair to Member Conley. So we had our technical assistance partners working with us, and we've run the parameters through the model, so we know we get to the number. That's like the first step. And then they also put out a model bylaw, which I used as like the template. There was a lot of stuff in there that was just kind of overkill for Braintree. I really want to keep this simple and not overcomplicated. And then they also had, like, in addition to the draft, they had, like, I guess, I don't know what the word, like a guide, and guidance. And for this section, these are some pointers that we give. We also sent the draft to our technical assistance partners, and the board members have their comments. We've looked at those comments. Most of those are kind of housekeeping comments. Tighten up on this, Melissa. You know, this part's not very clear. Then some other funny ones like, do you really want this there, and other things like that. So we're using the resources that we have. I've also put in, we had a call with DHCD around the excluded lands a couple weeks ago. So they've made themselves available, and we're talking to the right people there. There's a team of a few people who have been helping communities through this. And I put in a request today to regroup with them before we go to the council hearing to do exactly what you've said. We're comfortable that we do have a few questions for them around the affordability. That's one of the questions. And then Connor and I are going to just double check. We were playing around with it this morning a little bit. We're gonna just rerun the model again, just to double check. We've run it a few times, but it doesn't hurt to run it again. So we're using the tools that we have available to us. I mean, there was an option to submit your full draft, but you had to submit it 90 days before, and that wasn't an option for us, unfortunately.
And then the review process, do you expect that to be more so seeing that you're in compliance, or do you expect them to return feedback that would require adjustment or amendment?
I am not sure, and it's interesting. When I had asked, when we were on the call with DHCD a couple weeks ago, I said, you know, can we ask you how many communities have submitted? And they're like, yeah, it's public information. And interestingly enough, there were communities that submitted, but none of them were rapid transit communities. But when I do have this call, I can ask them that question. Is this gonna be like a pass-fail, or is this gonna be, you know, a check with some comments, you know? I would assume they would, if they're going to strike something for non-compliance, I think they'd have to tell you why. Whether or not they're going to tell you what they want in exchange for that, I'm not sure. But it would be very unfair for them to just say, this comes out. Yeah, go ahead.
May I add something, Madam Chair? Thank you. Just to that point, from my understanding of some of the recent guidance that's been put out, is that once we have submitted the ordinance for review for the state agency to review, then we're going to be deemed in compliance. And my understanding of that was, even if there are some things that they need to make tweaks on, we'll still be deemed in compliance during that period, because we've done everything that we're supposed to do. We submitted it in a timely manner. It's going through the process. You know, so, but I anticipate, based on all the hard work that the staff here has done, and with all this sort of like interdisciplinary outreach that we've done with the state agencies and the technical assistance, that we feel pretty confident that what we're going to put forward is going to be compliant. So.
Okay, thank you. And then the other point that I would say is that the amendment to this that's been proposed, I don't think that we should consider at this time.
Okay. I have a couple questions and comments. I get some of the concerns as far as style. I don't know how well that's represented in the site plan process, but is that possible to add in here additional oversight on the style proposed for the type of project?
Architectural, if I may, through the chair, are you talking about architectural review?
Correct, right.
I'm not sure. Like design guidelines?
Right, just some of the comments that were raised with.
So, yeah, and one of the things that had come up, and Crystal, please jump in if it, you can't treat these any different than you would treat any other multifamily developments in the town. So to me, that meant, you know, and there was a lot of stuff in the sample that was related to that. But again, you look at like communities like Newton, they got 14 versions of design guidelines for the 14 villages. We don't have any of that, but we can vet that. Yeah.
So if we can't, one of the things that the town should consider is whether or not to put in additional town-wide style requirements. That might be something to think about. And I guess the second thing that I really hadn't thought about until I was looking at the examples, but the roof deck aspect, is it possible to prohibit roof decks without a special permit? Just thinking of if there's a multifamily proposed next to a single family house, for example, where that person might be a little bit more uncomfortable if they propose within the 4 stories to do a roof deck. Do you know if that's something that could be included?
So one of the things in the bylaw, and one of the areas that was most prominent in regards to single families and small was at Armstrong. And in Armstrong, I built in a buffer against those properties. So the first 50 feet can be, the first 50 has to be landscaping, 50 to 100 can be parking and other things, and then the buildings need to be 100. So that would be the closest that something like that would be. I think that we could, I'm sure we could do roof deck or use of the roof by, and I guess then how would you treat would it be just the residential? Like not like a roof of like a garage? I'm just trying to gauge.
Right. I'm thinking mainly a residential roof deck. But
And is it proximity or is it use and noise that's driving?
I would think if I lived next door, I'd be more concerned about viewpoint, so buffering trees, just making sure that somebody couldn't look down from their rooftop onto my property very easily.
Okay.
If I may, Madam
Yes.
Chair, just a comment here is that any regulation regarding roof decks would have to apply town-wide. It wouldn't be able to be restricted with MBTA communities, and I think that, you know, that's something that the planning board and the planning department can consider separately, because that seems that may be a proposal of sort of you know, sort of good common sense to adopt town-wide. So. Okay. And as far as some of the questions with the cap and the height, and I agree with Member Conley's comment that I'm not that interested, and you know, I think a few people, Member McCamey and Ken also mentioned, I'm not that interested in removing those aspects as drafted as long as we comply with the state model. I think that's the goal here, but I'm also not necessarily opposed to having a conversation with a property owner or a proposed developer looking at what that looks like. Mm-hmm. But is there something that would make sense to build in at this point with the variance, or do you think the existing variance structure in Braintree would be sufficient? Or if there was a special
if I may, through the chair, if we're going the variance route, I mean, that's pretty tight under state law, and the criteria is pretty tight. The special permit is something that we would need to address if we wanted to put some criteria in there for some kind of bonuses.
Okay. And so at this point, of course, the proposals in front of us is the planning board to make a recommendation to town council. So could that be something that was considered prior to the final version of building in a special permit?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Yeah. And I do appreciate all the work that you and the rest of the planning department put into this with the consultant. I think a lot of it addresses some of Braintree's concerns while also trying to comply with the state's mandate, which is a big difference from what Braintree's done. And there's a lot of various aspects that have been talked about with the lawsuits, potential lawsuits and loss of funds. And I know, like, with Member McCamey's point about what about infrastructure, like the Mass Works grants are more typically given when there's a housing development tied to it. So keeping that Mass Works possibility for if and when a project comes through the door with an application, I think is important. A couple of the other comments that people made tonight, as far as the wetlands, I thought one thing that might be helpful to note is that the local wetlands bylaws would still apply to this. So as a comparison, if somebody comes in with a 40B application, then the local bylaws don't apply unless they can be shown why they should. So for the most part, they don't apply. So even if the zoning allowed 30 units per acre, but the wetland buffering pushed that in, that doesn't mean that they get to override the wetlands because of the density. That still applies for the protections of the wetlands. And I also thought it was helpful with your description of the density versus the size, that some districts have a higher density because we could keep the districts smaller by doing that. So if it was a lower density, we would have had to make the districts bigger. And the MBTA, I completely understand some of the comments of the shape that the MBTA is in. I mean, I think one thing that's good about the locations where this was put into place is that there's the MBTA aspect, but there's also the walkability and the biking. And if somebody got from Boston to Braintree by bike, then you can certainly get around Braintree sometimes faster by walking and biking. And I appreciated that the draft includes a connection to make sure that any applications that come through think about that connection for walking and biking and how that works out to promote some of the other aspects that can help reduce the traffic impact and help some of the local businesses in those areas by giving more people that can go to them. And I think, at the end of the day, we haven't done a lot with zoning, and that in some ways is a good thing, in some ways is a bad thing. Member McCamey noted an application that's been in front of the planning board for close to a year now for the Motel 6 property where they have a drive-through going there, and the traffic impact is significantly higher than a housing proposal would have been. So yes, housing does draw cars, but so does commercial uses, and sometimes a lot more. So I appreciated the work. I would have liked to see more community meetings as far as the location of where the parcels were, involving the owners and the adjacent community. But we've been left with what we have, where we have a short time frame to take a look at the guidelines, take a look at the local guidelines that were put into place based on the state mandate and brought to this point. And I think that the planning department did a very, very good job with putting together the information based on the information that was out there and the limitations that we have in the town. So I guess with that, I feel for if there's any other member comments that have come up after listening to other people speak. No. All right, so our job here tonight is to make a recommendation on the proposal, and at that point send it to town council to make a vote on the proposal also. we probably do, don't we? Yeah. So next we'll be doing a motion to close the public hearing. All right, motion by member Strelazzi. Do we have a second? Second by member Kent. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? And I should have mentioned earlier, so the voting members on the application tonight are member McCamey, myself, member Kent, member Grove, and member Strelazzi. And so now our job is a recommendation to town council on the proposal. And
So, Madam Chair, I think the odds are against us on this one, so I'm going to recommend favorable action on Town Council Order 23-076, 1 and 2. Did I say that right, Madam Director?
And I think one other point is that there's still technical comments that are coming in from our consultant and from the state, and so there may be some changes based on that to ensure that we continue with state compliance. And I guess actually I'm gonna just do it. And then the other question is whether we add in a special permit. So a special permit, ask the staff to further explore a special permit. So I think we could do a motion to recommend the bylaw with the technical comments to ensure compliance. A recommendation to include technical comments and a potential special permit to build into the bylaw additional height and density if appropriate. I think those are really the two main things. Yes, okay. Sorry.
Yes, my motion would include everything you just said. Yes.
So get with the state and with our TA, and any comments that come back from them get incorporated into the draft, and then put together language related to, is it just height relief by special permit?
I think height and cap.
Okay.
Okay, we have a motion by member McCamey. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second by member Strelazzi. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed?
Opposed.
Okay, and since our staff is in here that usually does that, I'll just do the roll call. So member McCamey was a yes, member Crowe, myself was a yes, member Ken, yes, member Strelazzi, yes, and member Grove, a no. And that's it, all right? Thank you. And then
Thank you,
just a
everyone, and
motion
thank you for all the
Yes,
favorable
thank you.
comments this evening on the work that we've done.
Yes. And then we'll be looking for a motion to adjourn.
Oh, yeah.
Motion to adjourn by member Grove. Do we have a second? Second by member Strelazzi. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All right. Thank you all for coming.